Today on the Perception in Action podcast, when a coach identifies a maladaptive movement pattern in an athlete, what is the best way to change it? Do formal biomechanical evaluations help? How can we identify the origins of a movement problem? And how can we improve agility and speed without breaking the perception action cycle? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to look at some interesting new research on the topic of changing movement patterns. As I've discussed in previous episodes, there are good and bad reasons to want to change the way an athlete moves. Conforming to a quote-unquote perfect technique? Bad. Reducing the chance of injury? Good. As a coach, it's the only way you know how to teach it and you've been doing it that way forever? Bad. Making an athlete faster and more agile within the context of their sport? Good. Assuming we have a good reason, how do we do it? Let's look at what some recent research tells us. The first study I want to look at was published earlier this year by Glenn Fleissig and colleagues from the American Sports Medical Institute, or ASMI. Their primary question of interest was, do formal biomechanical evaluations lead to movement change? To address this, 46 healthy baseball pitchers, 19 amateur and 27 professional, ranging in competition level from high school to the majors, were evaluated at two different time points, which were an average of 1 year apart. Previous research has shown that there seems to be a tolerable range of pitching mechanics, outside of which tends to increase the chance of injury. For example, if a pitcher's stride length is too long, their lead foot lands too open or too far closed, or their external shoulder rotation is too small or too large, there is an increased chance for injury to the throwing arm. The evaluation used in the study involved pitchers throwing 10 full-effort fastballs, while their movements were recorded with a motion tracking system running at 240 Hz. 8 kinematic parameters, including stride length and shoulder rotation, which have been previously associated with injury risk and performance, were calculated for each pitch. The mean values for all 8 parameters were computed for each participant based upon 10 fastball trials, and then compared with normative ranges for 100 elite pitchers previously tested at ASMI. These ranges were plus or minus 1 standard deviation around the mean for each variable. Separate normative ranges were used for elite, pro players that could throw over 88 miles per hour, and non-elite pitchers. A pitcher was considered to have a movement flaw when a parameter was outside the normative range, either above or below. After each evaluation, the biomechanists at ASMI produced a personalized video analysis of the pitcher, showing and explaining the flaws detected. These were sent directly to the player or to their team, depending on the situation. The key research questions were as follows. How many of the flaws were corrected when the pitcher returned for the second evaluation a year later? Are professionals better able to correct flaws than amateurs? Are there particular movements that are easier to correct than others? A flaw was corrected, of course, when a parameter went from outside to inside the normative range between visits. What was found? Overall, the 46 pitchers had 138 flaws, of which 61 or 44% were corrected. There were no significant differences between the flaw correction rate for the pros and the amateurs. Correcting the front foot landing position was the easiest, with 76% of pitchers that had this issue showing a correction, while flaws in knee extension were the most difficult to correct at only 23% success rate. Overall, the toughest flaws to fix seem to be those that occurred near the time of ball release, that is, knee extension and shoulder abduction. The authors propose that this is due to the nature of the kinetic chain involved in pitching. Specifically, changing parameters measured at foot contact require the pitcher to change movements during the relatively slow part of the delivery, for example, altering their arm path, while altering parameters closer to ball release require changes during the rapid arm cocking and acceleration phase of the pitching delivery. Finally, 41 new flaws, or 18% of the total, developed between the two time periods. Overall, I think this is a really interesting study, which shows that simply identifying the problems and even providing rich feedback through video demonstration is not sufficient to successfully correct technical flaws at a high rate. As the authors acknowledge, one limitation of this study is that the biomechanical evaluations were likely to have been used by pitchers in a variety of different ways, involving a variety of different people, from parents of amateurs to major league pitching coaches. So obviously, a valuable future study would involve the same type of pre-post measurement with some control over and assessment of the method used for correction. One final point I will make. On the surface, the criterion used for a flaw in the study seems to violate the good-bad distinction I laid out at the start of the episode, in that the flaw was a deviation from some predefined optimal technique. However, it should be noted that the parameters measured do allow for individual variations, depending on the constraints of the performer. For example, the normative for stride length is measured as a proportion of the pitcher's height. And second, for most of these parameters, research has shown that going out of these ranges does significantly increase the chance for injury. The second article I want to discuss involves a series of guidelines for correcting movement published earlier this year by Howe and Cushion. The primary problem they focus on is identifying the root cause of a movement fault. This can be difficult due to the nature of the kinetic chains involved in most complex movements. A problem at one joint segment may cause a movement fault further on down the chain at another segment. As we saw in the Fleissig study, this can make correcting the fault difficult because the coach may be focusing on the end result instead of the root cause. In their paper, Howe and Cushion present a 4-stage problem-solving strategy for dealing with this issue. The first stage is identifying the relevant movement patterns where the flaw seems to occur. The key here is specificity, because it's been shown that the movement quality in one pattern, for example performing a squat movement, has poor predictive value for other movement patterns, say doing a lunge movement. For example, a limited range of motion may influence one type of movement pattern, but the athlete may be able to compensate in some other way for this issue with a different pattern. It is essentially the bliss of motor abundance at work. Another important factor to take into account is the performer's skill level. As I've talked about a few times on the podcast, what looks like a movement problem may actually be a deliberate attempt to freeze degrees of freedom when learning a new skill. The second stage in the approach presented in this paper involves evaluating the interaction between the athlete and the environment in which the task is performed. Here, the authors emphasize the importance of the coach or trainer having some fundamental knowledge of the biomechanics of the movement task. What forces are involved? What are the balance requirements? What are the constraints? The third stage essentially involves using a constraints-based approach to understand the movement problem. That is, manipulating the task, environment, or individual constraints in some manner. A common example of this is having an athlete perform a squat with their heels elevated or with their arms overhead. Through changes in the constraints of the movement, it is possible to either exaggerate or minimize any compensations the performer may be making. In terms of the constraints of the athlete, it is possible to manipulate these over a longer term, for example through exercises targeted at strength or flexibility in certain areas, and observe how these change the movement pattern. Finally, through this type of constraints manipulation, a root cause of the movement flaw can be isolated.
Something is calling me, not sure what that might be. It might be the road, might just be my soul moving on.
The final two studies I want to discuss are not so much concerned with correcting a flawed movement pattern, but rather improving the quality of some overall aspect of the movement within the context of the sport skill. Earlier this year, Spiteri and colleagues published an article looking at the development of agility. They first note that athletes who lack agility on the field can be grouped into one of two broad categories: fast thinkers with slow movement or slow thinkers with fast movement. Current training practices are primarily focused on the first group, that is, training to improve physical qualities like technique and strength. The vast majority of these drills involve breaking the perception action cycle. That is, the training attempts to enhance movement completely out of the context of the sport. For example, through the use of agility ladders or running around cones. The authors argue that there is a need to establish training drills that effectively integrate perception-action coupling to enhance decision-making and agility performance. To address these issues, the authors propose using a constraints-based approach, where agility performance is considered to be the outcome of individual, task, and environmental constraints. Individual constraints refer to characteristics of the athlete and how they affect movement output. These include physical, technical, and perceptual cognitive constraints. Physical constraints include things like anthropometrics and general motor ability. For example, it has been found that agility performance is related to the amount of lean body mass in the athlete, which can be increased through strength training. So strength does not directly affect agility, but it does create greater agility capacity in the athlete. Technical qualities refer to the athlete's ability to sequence appropriate muscle actions and adopt an appropriate body position. Within this category, it's been recently shown that the ability to control the force and impulse production is what is critical to agility performance. Perceptual constraints refer to an athlete's ability to control their gaze and pick up task-relevant information within their surrounding environment, whereas cognitive constraints refer to an athlete's ability to use this perceptual information to recognize patterns of play and anticipate an opponent's movements. As I've discussed in previous episodes of the podcast, faster and more agile athletes have been shown to consistently demonstrate a superior ability to anticipate using advanced cues, make use of situational probabilities by recognizing game situations, and visually scan their environment more efficiently than less skilled athletes. However, despite the substantial amount of research on these topics, it's not currently known which specific sources of perceptual information are used to achieve faster agility performance. Task constraints refer to the aims and rules of the particular activity being performed. A major limitation of much of agility training is that it does not faithfully represent the task constraints the athlete will face in the game. Specifically, drills often only use one change of direction and are done at a much slower speed. The authors emphasize that specificity is needed in training to achieve transfer to game conditions. Environmental constraints refer to the environment where the sport is being played and include things like the playing surface and presence of external distractions. A major limitation of the current agility training is that these tend to be held constant. The authors argued that variability in context is key to developing more robust and adaptable agility. If an athlete can develop movement solutions for a variety of different task and environmental constraints, this should enhance their performance in competition. The majority of current agility training is done using pre-planned drills, limiting athletes' opportunities to adjust their movement strategy to reach a desired goal. The authors emphasize that agility is context-specific, where athletes are required to match the most appropriate movement solution to a movement problem. As a result, movement execution during a game may not reflect what research has described as an optimal agility technique, and thus training should not always focus on movement perfection. This will, of course, make training messier, but it's likely to lead to better transfer. The last study I want to look at today was authored by Nick Winckelmann and examines attentional cueing to develop speed and acceleration. As I discussed way back in episode 7, although there are some caveats, overall there is strong evidence that an external focus of attention results in better performance across a wide range of sports. Unfortunately, however, as Nick points out, this is a message that has not really been absorbed effectively by coaches yet. For example, in 2010, Porter and colleagues interviewed U.S. track athletes and found that nearly 85% reported their coaches using internal focus of attention cues in practice, and nearly 70% of the athletes reported using an internal focus in competition. And because coaches tend to get most of their coaching knowledge from their peers, this is kind of a vicious cycle. So Nick's goal in this paper was to review the evidence for external focus of attention and present associated cueing guidelines in the specific context of training sprinters to increase acceleration and speed. Beyond track coaching, this information is highly generalizable because both acceleration and speed are, of course, critical in many other sports. To illustrate the internal-external distinction, Nick contrasts the coaching instructions push the ground away versus push off the inside edge of your foot. Although these two statements sound very similar and have the same goal of encouraging fast leg action, the difference between them is not trivial. Pushing the ground away encourages an external focus because it deals with the outcome of the movement, while pushing off the foot encourages an internal focus because it refers to the body movement itself. Nick then goes on to discuss important characteristics of coaching cues that go beyond this internal-external distinction. These are the 3 Ds: distance, direction, and description. The focus distance refers to how close to the performer's body their attention is, and is generally classified as either proximal or distal. For example, the cue, drive the barbell away from the bench, is a proximal external cue, because the bench is outside the body, but it's close to the lifter. Drive the barbell towards the ceiling would be an external distal cue. In general, the work of Wolf and colleagues has shown that a distal focus results in better performance. However, there does seem to be an expertise effect, as novices seem to benefit more from a proximal focus. It also seems to depend on the nature of the tasks, with those requiring maximal forces, like lifting or sprinting, benefiting more from a distal focus, while those that require more coordination, like hitting or catching, having better results with more proximal. Cue direction is an issue that has not really been well studied, but there is some evidence that a toward external focus is better than an away focus. I'm going to be presenting some work at the skill acquisition meeting I'm hosting here in Arizona next month on cueing baseball pitchers that is consistent with this result. I'll be talking about that in a podcast episode in the future as well. The description used for a coaching cue is something that is often overlooked, but it's critical for defining the spatial temporal pattern of movement that a coach wants an athlete to adopt. Nick uses the example of the cues punch versus push. While both convey the idea of making a forceful contact with an object, one is a short, quick contact, while the other is slower and sustained longer. Although they are usually not lumped in the same category, Nick correctly points out that using analogies, which I talked about back in episode 16, can be considered as a way to encourage an external focus of attention, because in most cases they do not explicitly draw attention to bodily movements. In the last part of his paper, Nick focuses on specific examples of cue usage in sprinting. He emphasizes the importance of coaches understanding the key kinematic and kinetic determinants of success in their sport. No matter whether a cue is internal or external, what distance it is, etc., if it's not aimed at a task-relevant feature of the skill, it will not be effective. For example, in sprinting, research has shown that it is the difference in the magnitude of horizontal force generated at push-off which distinguishes elite from less skilled sprinters. Therefore, cues should be designed to encourage horizontal force. The paper has tables with some great examples of how cues can be used for different elements of movement, including posture and leg and arm action. I think this would be a really effective starting point for coaches in other sports, so definitely check those out. So, to sum up, I think there's a lot of interesting work going on surrounding the topic of changing and enhancing movement patterns. Some of the key takeaways we see are the importance of specificity in keeping the perception action cycle intact, the importance of a coach having a deep understanding of the kinematics and kinetics of the movement they're trying to teach, the importance of tailoring coaching cues to the individual athlete and the specific training goals, and finally, while formal biomechanical evaluations are useful, they likely need to be combined with coaching to result in a high proportion of successful movement changes. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or on Twitter @ShakyWeights. And to find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.
Gone through St. Louis.